Hello and welcome to The Cynic. I'm Chris Gallagher. Normally on a Thursday we record and release The Cynic weekly, looking back at the recent Celtic games and giving you all the up-to-date news. However, this week we thought we'd present to you something a little different. The Reimagining of Football is a feature podcast hosted by Graeme and Christian and also featuring Jack Coles. Jack is the head of recruitment at Lincoln City Football Club and has a vast experience in football recruitment and data analysis at several clubs in England. The podcast looks at the state of modern football recruitment and how decisions are often made by more traditional means, with data not being fully utilised despite the success of clubs like Brighton and Brentford. The panel discuss managerial recruitment, the integration of data and youth development, and the challenges faced by clubs like Celtic in balancing long-term strategies with short-term competitive pressure. For more content like this, as well as almost daily Celtic podcasts, check out thecynic.co or search for The Cynic on Patreon. And now, the reimagining of football.
Hello and welcome to a feature podcast we are calling The Reimagining of Football. I'm your host Graeme and I'm joined by the yin to my yang Christian. These are the types of podcasts that we tend to do on the Patreon feed or the non-free feed. So if you listen to this and like what you hear, then get involved. We are joined, well, first of all, Christian, how are you?
Oh, well, Graeme, thanks for that snappy intro.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Okay. I'll get on with it because you often like to waylay me, but I'm not going to have it today. So we're joined by Jack Coles. Jack is someone whose latest job was as the head of recruitment at Lincoln City in League One. Obviously, Chris Sutton, legend down there at Lincoln. He has previously been the head of data at Coventry, an academy recruitment analyst at Leicester, and head of academy recruitment at Northampton Town. He's also been a football coach at Warwick University and done analytical consultant for the Guinea-Bissau national team. How are you, Jack? Thanks for coming on the pod.
No, thanks for having me. I'm very well. I hope you guys are too.
Christian,
yes,
we often talk about this stuff. Why did you want to bring a so-called professional onto the podcast?
Well, I'm speaking to Jack quite a bit recently through a common friend of us. So I know Jack has a lot of interesting thoughts and principles I get about how recruitment should work, how a football club can be run maybe more effectively, and how, as we kind of refer to the title, maybe reimagine some of the accepted norms within football. Maybe especially outside the very elite, very progressive clubs that are, trying to look at things very differently, which I think is obviously very relevant to Celtic at the moment. It's relevant to, as you say, to a lot of what we talk about on podcasts. But as you also quite rightly say, that's us pontificating from the outside of the industry. Jack is actually, he works within the industry, he's got an experience within the industry, and he's faced with a range of challenges when he actually has to try and influence that kind of change and put his ideas into practice within the industry, which is obviously a lot more difficult. So we wanted to bring Jack on for a little while to have him talk about that. But another very relevant part to Celtic right now at this point is that at this moment we still don't have a new permanent manager. And I know Jack has worked also on how the recruitment process for managers, for head coaches might work, because that's maybe an area that is not as well defined, not as maybe analytical at the moment as the player recruitment has become. So, but Jack, as Graeme says, I got a tendency to wail on, so I'm not going to try and do that too much. But obviously, Graeme gave you a kind of a rundown of where you've been and where you worked. But it'd be good to kind of start to get your thoughts on, well, I guess how you ended up as an industry professional and what is it like working in modern football recruitment right now? What sort of stage is that that the industry in at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear all of the kind of context behind why we're speaking, I suppose. But it's funny, it wasn't necessarily that my role. I think I'm lucky that my life has coincided with the football industry expanding out into a multidisciplinary environment. It wasn't clear because I did my coaching badges in preparation to be a coach, because it was the only way I could foresee having a future in football was through coaching. I didn't necessarily think I'm brilliant as a coach, and I'm not sure I necessarily enjoyed that side of the game. But as I say, luckily I must have had a crystal ball somewhere as a youth. But the sort of multidisciplinary and kind of specialization of the game, as I say, coincided with my my working age, just about. So I did some other jobs, mainstream jobs, before working full-time in football. But that was how the route came along. A lot of people who asked me for advice about how to get in the game are way better qualified at their age than I was. So it's exciting to see who's coming through at the moment. But I'd say modern football recruitment, and I suppose the context I need to give is that I've only worked at certain levels, right, and been exposed to certain things. What I'm saying I would assume would be the case from stories from the industry, but I think at the moment I'd say we're still pre-data, if that's a phrase, certainly through my experience. Now, that isn't to say that data doesn't exist in football, but I think it was, to cite Billy Bean, maybe not for the last time, but data workflows exist heavily in football, right? And this is like National League up. I think most decisions are taken traditionally around the senior stakeholders of clubs just having that data maybe give a little bit of weight in any one direction, but ultimately they just make the decision that they think feels best for them. I'd say all of the Premier League teams beginning with B seem to understand that that's maybe an edge that they can fly past. I'm trying to think if there's another Prem team beginning with B that I've included in that doesn't do it. But I'm talking about obviously Brighton, Brentford and Bournemouth. So I think there are huge returns on full data integration into senior decision making. But I don't think we're there yet. As I say, I think the industry, from my perspective, tends to be data is part of an argument. It can be part of an argument where, you know, a chief scout's ringing a former coach of this player and this coach giving a verbal opinion about what they are like as a professional. That's an equivalent to the data that's offered about analysis on the player, which from my perspective, they shouldn't be seen as equivalent. I think we're still in a place where data's used extensively, but decisions are still made traditionally.
Jack, so I think that's a very astute point. Do you think that is because a lot of clubs feel they need to have a data department, but they only really want to use it if it coincides with the opinions of the main decisions makers anyway? Or is it just a case of kind of don't fully trust us yet to give ourselves completely over to data?
Yeah, both. I suppose both are correct. I mean, a part of that is on. So my background, my ascent into the game was through being 5 years ahead of data trends. Probably at this point now, from being ahead of department twice, you just have less time to absorb future metrics and kind of frontiers of data analysis. But there are huge ones in the future that I'll try and integrate. But it is to some extent down to a poor connection between data professionals, people who trust data, and I put myself in that camp, and then maybe us not explaining or putting things into black box terms where stakeholders don't trust the ultimate verdict. And then there's another couple of wrinkles. One is time, right? So recruitment, the working model of a recruitment function within a football club is pretty fast paced. The concept that you can sort of put the pause button on everything on real life and just dive into 4 weeks of showing ownership algorithms and modeling is just not going to happen. I suppose my concept of a recruitment department, that I wouldn't want to work that close to the. I don't think you need to work in that sort of at that speed. Sometimes I think if you future-proof what you've got and the context around player departures or player arrivals, I think you're probably a little bit. You probably find a little bit of surplus time you didn't know you had. But as well, within the EFL context, ownership has changed, and yeah, there's probably. I mean, a lot of these are from overseas groups that do run and do look at data in their day-to-day job outside. You know, if somebody runs a financial fund, then they're used to modeling, right? But for some reason, when they come to talk to their football club, that's the kind of Saturday job or whatever, that the trust in those working structures doesn't quite run over. But it's a generational thing, right? I mean, I'm on a Talent 4 course at the FA about leadership and management in a recruitment context, and everybody on that sort of agrees with me, but nobody in that group is in a position of kind of ultimate sporting directorship, right? So, and they will be, right? I think a couple of them have gone on to be sporting directors within the 18 months of this course. So this generation is coming along. I think to some extent that people who've been exposed to different norms in football are still ultimate decision makers.
Jack, when you inevitably become a sporting director, Celtic do need one, as Graeme has pointed out there. If you, because this concept of data, especially if you set aside the industry, maybe even if you're not that interested in data, the concept of data always comes up in discussions around recruitment. Now, if you were that all-powerful role within a club, how much weight would you give to data in terms of that whole recruitment process? I know that's a big question, but is it more than what is the average now, or is there dangers in relying too much on data?
I think that so data gives you breadth. I think not depth. Or well, depending on your function, the data that I've been embedded in the two contexts around recruitment, we've had tons of breadth, and so and by that I mean we could assess 200,000 footballers against a positional profile at the push of a button, right? And so you're looking at the Dutch second division as I love the Dutch second division, by the way, but you're seeing that this guy who scores really, really well against your profiles is superb, right? But then I went out to Holland to see a game, and the player in question didn't perhaps fit the physical description of what League One tended to be used to. I don't think it made him any worse a player, but the optics of doing that would have been really difficult to explain to senior people at the club, right? So to answer your question, data would be used more. I would use it more, but you can't sometimes substitute that depth that you do need. And by depth, I don't necessarily mean that you need to go and see them live. I think sports science and physiotherapy need to be heavily involved in recruitment, and I always have. I think my last job shaped that, but often you'll have people who want to make decisions based on risk, but the physiotherapist just come up with something that's a little bit inconvenient. But I think that those guys know about what it takes to get a football player on a pitch, and they can build much more of a data picture and a risk profile for the player. So I think those kind of things need embedding. And then, when we say data, it is a vague term, isn't it? Like, one thing what I wanted to introduce at Lincoln City was we brought in a data scientist to do predictive modelling and to build things that helped us understand the future, because a lot of the context of event data, tracking data, helps us understand the past and a past player performance. But I would use data more, but it would have to be at a higher technical level to predict and simulate, which is a key component of what I think needs to go into that picture.
I think those of us who've kind of been following football from outside the industry for a while, we know there is event data, everything that happens on the ball. I guess we're vaguely aware of tracking data coming in. That's everything that's off the ball. But it seems that the data role, whereas maybe you had previously had one guy who watched the video, did some Vice Scout data and stats pump data. I think what we're seeing more and more now is you're getting into things like really predictive modeling that requires some heavy data scientist qualifications to build the models. And then you have maybe people who oversee that or take knowledge from that and put it into the practical use. I guess do you think there's a real shift in how the way data needs to be done is now on a much higher, I was going to say more complicated for me, but a much more almost interface that it's a far way away from where it started, essentially, weighing how many tackles, how many forward passes, how many passes like that. It's a whole new world, really.
Yeah, I think the granularity of the data that tracking. So not to patronise, but like tracking data has been pretty industry entrenched for, I'd say, 5-6 years. you had Will Spearman doing stuff with tracking data at Liverpool under Ian and working with him. So yeah, it comes to trade-off for me. Like and having worked under more limited resources, like if it's 4 days of intensive coding and interrogating data analytics to get to a decision that's kind of 2% more, moves the needle on the risk profile 2% more, it's probably not going to be worth it. I think that huge data departments, the like of which are seen in the Premier League, the skills are probably higher, so that time is shrunk, and then it probably moves the needle a little bit more because your market, 2% matters a lot to Liverpool because their player pool is just tiny because there's only so many players who can play for Liverpool. So I think the context is the important thing in terms of what data you're using and how you're using it. I think that, the capacity to ingest tracking data and it was something I tried to move toward when I worked in the Championship, but it because we had fixed stadium cameras, so we had 12 in-stadium cameras to pull tracking data. Most of the public or the kind of off-the-shelf tracking data is computer inference. So if a player moves, so it's from TV, and there are various skeletal things that can make sure that a player is where he is right when he's on camera, but when he goes off camera, they have to infer from modeling. And then, like weird things like if the shirt numbers are grey and the kit is grey, it sometimes misidentifies players and stuff. So, your validation on those kind of things is probably not as good. But the fixed camera stuff was definitely accurate enough for us to build things from in Coventry. But I think I ended up moving on before we got to really have a good run on that. But I think it's a context. I hope I've answered the question. I feel like I
think you validated Manchester United when they were complaining about not being able to see each other on their grey strips, remember, back in the day. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is Ian Caffro 9 years ago came to the Scottish League and was basically disregarded from moment one because he had a laptop. And one of the things that often gets thrown at Gavin Strachan, who not to call him a cockroach, but he comes across like the cockroach of Celtic because he survives every kind of transition, and he's sitting there with his laptop, and he often gets abuse just for the way he looks sitting with his laptop. What I'm getting at is the way that maybe Scottish football, I think British football for a while was behind these trends, but the English game is obviously at the forefront of it now. Scotland still seems a bit far back when it comes to these things. Peter Lawwell, one of his famous quotes was that he said that Celtic is not like Ajax. They can't afford to lose a league because if they do, it's a zero-sum game. If they lose a league, it goes to Rangers and the fans are not happy about it. So when it comes to Celtic, we kind of have a vague overview of what the infrastructure is like. We know that they've got a head of data. We know that just a few days ago they advertised for a junior data analyst. Speaking to our friend in common, the idea is that you should have a minimum of 4 people in these positions, like dividing it up between like engineers and scientists and analysts. What do you think, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this fully, but what do you think for a club the size of Celtic, 100 million revenue, Champions League football, what should the infrastructure look like at a club that size, do you think?
I mean, I think four is probably, I think our mutual friend is probably erring on the side of like the minimum possible. I think 4 is a bit light. I will answer that question, but I suppose the issue becomes that given, let's say, 90% of Celtic's matches are not going to be played on those edges, right? Like you've got huge games of the Champions League, Rangers, and then whatever club in Scotland's having a good year other than Rangers that you may be looking for edges on. I think that probably creates an issue for Celtic where there's the competitive pressure, not to trigger anyone, but like to make a comparison, like if you're in somewhere like London, the competitive pressure around having other clubs in your spitting distance just crushing you on some parts, right, does make your data infrastructure more demanded more of, because the competitive pressure is such that if you don't keep up with what's around you, you're going to fall behind. I think that probably Celtic don't have, although there are really competitive scenarios, and I speak to someone who has a a rough association, a rough familiarity with Scottish football. So I don't want to diminish what's at stake in that part of the world. But I do think sometimes an infrastructure can be undermined by the competitive environment that they're in. I think Celtic should have somebody who can specialise in tracking data as a minimum, and that's a job. At Celtic, they should have somebody who can specialise in data visualisation, because I think that's a crucial part of communicating to stakeholders. Often data visualisation directives can come from people who are non-data, who just like to see certain things on certain graphs.
But that would be almost articulating and presenting the data to people that don't understand it so well.
Yeah. And like data visualization is a specialism, right? It's a field of expertise. And the guy who got very popular at The Guardian, whose name I'm blanking on, I think it might be in the Financial Times, but during COVID, like, he's a data viz. His design choices on his visualization were because he's an expert. So I think Celtic should have one of those. Generally, it can be like, oh, the manager doesn't like to see certain visualization techniques. For me, that isn't really up to them. I think a club the size of Celtic should have a data viz expert. And then, some sort of data architecture, data engineering, someone to ingest, store, and support the analysis. So I suppose, and then a head of data. But I think that so much of football, and this is why as a line manager, I've always tried to, for my top data people, and I've worked with two that I consider, one's just joined a Champions League club, and I'm really supportive of him, and then somebody else I work with. One of the big things I can do for them is create time. I think that the more staff you have in your data department who are not idle, but interrogating hypotheses that have value to the club, as long as it's in the best interest of Celtic, creating time for your analysts is important, because whenever I created time for my staff, they generally come back to me and say, you didn't ask me for this, but I've done this, and does it seem to help you? And almost always it did. So I think, you should have a head of data, someone who's data visualization, someone who's tracking data, because I think it's a different specialist field, someone who's data architecture, data storage, and data engineering, if that isn't lumping too much in, and then let's say a group of 3 or 4 junior analysts who can work up for different departments, right? Performance, recruitment, sports science.
And one of the issues that we have spoken about and kind of been really frustrated about, and I want to ask you, because you have that mix between recruitment data and the youth academy, is our past. So basically, the last 5 years of Celtic has been with managers that require specific things from their players. It is managers that require the goalkeepers to be good with their feet, or centre backs to be good with their feet. For Ange, it was obviously the fullbacks coming in and being comfortable operating in the central midfield. Yeah. And then going to our academy and not seeing these players given pathways, not seeing these players brought through, not seeing them given game time. And then at the same time, the recruitment team going out and buying players that are just not suited to those roles whatsoever, like centre-backs that can't pass the ball the length of themselves. How should those 3 areas, the recruitment, the youth, and the data, work in harmony in a football club? What is the theory behind what you would expect when it comes to bringing players into the first team, whether that's through the academy or recruitment? How should that work in theory?
I suppose it's not to swerve the question, but I think the context is important. So if your club is prescriptive around that, if your club is prescriptive around player profiles, which it sounds like potentially it's led by the manager, I think that's not the most optimum choice. I suppose it depends on certain stakeholders planning to be at Celtic and understanding they can be at Celtic as much as it's in their control for a sensible amount of time to kind of have this throughput. But if your manager's choosing the profile of your players, you're obviously always susceptible to the turnover of your manager, right? So, and this is why my inclination is always to be slightly concerned about prescriptive managers and then player turnover. I mean, I don't want to name names. I'm sure anybody can think of a manager who has a heavy design around who they want in their building. The second they're gone, it just creates 5 or 6 players who are just now essentially redundant, because the next guy who's brought in maybe wants something slightly different, right? Now, I think if that comes from more senior stakeholders at the club, and then the manager is recruited because they can work with that sort of player, that club model seems fine to me. And then it is just about comparing apples for apples with what's in your academy. So one of the things we did at a previous club was try and code out the academy games, particularly at the senior 11 aside ends, in the same way with the first team, so that we could essentially have some kind of throughput as to what they did on the pitch compared to others. Now, youth football is just not as intense as senior football, so you need to find some way to make sense of that gap. But that kind of joined up club model is a good way forward. One thing I do advocate more, and it's probably less fashionable these days, is like somebody who's a head coach who can work under the line of like typically Italian coaches, is like, you show me the squad and I'll tell you my formation, right? Or I'll tell you my style of football. I do think that kind of manager isn't particularly fashionable these days, but because of the breadth of players they can work with, they're probably a little bit better at integrating younger players and other players within the squad, just because they're so, able to integrate most systems and and I think for some clubs that's appropriate. Like a lot of clubs seem to be steering into, manager-led game models when there's a finite amount of managers who can implement that game model. So you're kind of reducing your market a little bit, and then it's fine to do. But the question will be why? Like, why do you want a game model? Is it because you want Celtic to be synonymous with attractive passing, possession, football, building up from the back, or do you just want to do it because Guardiola does it? Like, I think that the root cause of why you want to establish that game model is important, but I do think there's trade-offs. But I saw Ben Doak when he was with Celtic's youth team, and I said to somebody else, it's like very rare to see someone so clearly above the level of that match. Nobody left that game in any doubt that he was way better than that level. I don't know whether it was a kind of mishmatch on profiles or whether Ben just didn't have some support in the first team, or whether there wasn't the joined up communication between the 21s, or it was the 18s, I think, as it was then. But Ben seemed utterly appropriate for Celtic's first team, especially when most seasons they should be comfortably ahead in the league by like January, so there's the context there in the second half of the year to get him on the pitch. But yeah, Celtic seem to have some things really set and really, really supportive of youth integration, but strangely sometimes don't always seem to capitalise on those academy players.
Which is a big topic for us as well in a lot of these podcasts. Jack, I think almost maybe a slight detour, but maybe take us into another field I know we've been working quite a bit on. So we've talked a lot about data in terms of how recruitment, or clubs in modern football who are good at recruitment. The other thing that kind of pops up, which is very almost at the opposite end of data, we hear a lot about things like off the pitch scouting. And we hear a lot about clubs like Brentford and maybe Brighton doing a lot of research into what the players are like outside of the pitch. Now, Graeme and I have mentioned this on the pod a lot of times because we've been reading Ian Graham's book, and he talks about a couple of examples where that kind of off-the-pitch scouting almost went to things like Liverpool not signing Sadio Mane because the kind of reports on him was way off. But I think that's... And we also talked about how that sort of recruitment is very fraught with danger because there's very little... How can you do analysis on it? How can you validate, people's opinion on those kind of things? So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, but also then how that maybe lead into another area you've been working, which is coaching recruitment, and how, to me, on the face of it, something like off the pitch, personality, things like that would be heavily important in trying to find a new head coach or a manager.
Can I just piggyback on that as well before you answer? One of the things that Celtic get accused of quite often, and you can see this in this interim stage where we've brought Mark Fotheringham in, who was a former Celtic player. Stephen McManus has gone up to the first team, former Celtic player. Johnny Hayes has just joined the academy, former Celtic player. What do you think should be that balance between someone who knows the culture of the club and getting in fresh ideas from abroad?
Okay. So yeah, I'll go with the order of the question. Personality assessments. Again, it's probably one of those where the resources, the context behind the depth of that work. And anecdotally, I know clubs that have kind of closed deals on players who had way more lucrative options elsewhere because their intensive work on the player and the person was such that they convinced the player to join them because of how well they knew the individual. Some clubs do it, but do it poorly, which I think doesn't make tons of sense. I think if you're probably better off not really worrying about it if you're going to do it poorly, and because obviously the issue can be that it's pretty unempirical. That there aren't these psychological tests that you can just roll out and see what someone's like, right? Particularly remotely. I think probably rightly quite a lot of players would feel quite triggered if you said, well, we're going to sign you, but we need you to submit to this questionnaire because so I think that the market of football players is not too dissimilar to the market in any other field of kind of elite performance, in that it's got to be normally distributed, hasn't it? Like, most players have good days and bad days, but are generally basically all right people, to an extreme end of very unprofessional and very hard to work with, to absolute model professionals, right? And those are the tail ends of that distribution. I think that the rule around not having these kind of challenging or difficult personalities probably belies the fact that elite sport does something to people that probably isn't particularly healthy, right? If you're up for selection year on year or game on game, that's probably not going to make you a harmonious character, right? And I think that probably football needs to take a little bit of an assessment of that. I do think there's a big space of personality profiles that the industry just self-selects for, that's probably not optimal, right? I think certainly growing up, I was never a very good player, right? But I knew pretty soon that I wasn't a particularly typical football dressing room person, right? And so that was like, okay, well, I'm less interested in sitting in a football dressing room because I don't really fit in with that group of people, right? So now, I mean, maybe I'm not the best example, but there must be some players who are really good who are just put off by that and drift away from the sport before they really get the chance to get embedded in it. I think you need to have a really soft touch on that. If you ring somebody and ask someone what a player's like, they're going to bring their own biases to it as well. I mean, we had an incident where we rang somebody about a player and the player and this person just didn't get along, right? And in the same way that I'm sure that anybody who's basically nice has people they don't get along with for whatever reason, but we rang the only person in the world this guy didn't get along with, and it gave the club some concern around getting the deal closed. I think there's probably a much larger base of psychological profiles that football clubs can consume and integrate into their squad. I think player care is essential. I think League One, League Two teams, because of post-Brexit legislation around who you can sign, are bringing in players from abroad, but perhaps not landing on that player care particularly well. I don't think the solution is just to put them on the pitch. I think they need to feel like a genuine support, and that's not always right. I think if you've got a big space and a big department, and particularly people who know about psychology to work through this, it makes much more sense. But I'd say to have a soft touch on it is probably better than to be really bedded into some psychological characteristics. And there is always the fact that the club will just tolerate certain behaviours if it means they get 3 points, right? And to a certain extent, I'd sort of say that was sensible, right? If somebody's genuinely moody or genuinely challenging enough to kind of annoy most staff in the building, but they go out and win 3 points, then it's difficult to say that that's probably not worth it. If 3 points are hard to come by.
As you say that, I think that's a really interesting point. And other interesting work you've done as a kind of reference there, it's like that coaching recruitment, because that seems like an area where it's really untapped games. Obviously, like Celtic is looking for one at the moment, and I'd assume things like off the field behaviour would be a big part of that. But obviously, as a coach, you don't have much data other than how the team has done. How do you recruit for a head manager, a head coach or a manager, as in maybe a different way than you do for a player, or should they actually be more alike than what they are at the moment?
So I suppose, to link personalities to link personality stuff and manager stuff. I think if you are a club that says we are going to tolerate some interesting characters because we don't have much money and the interesting characters are cheap, we need a coach who's really, really good at working with challenging characters. And there are people that are, or a player care that can give a player the hour and a half he needs to pick through his water bills and simmer down whatever kind of bubbling anxiety the guy has. So yeah, your head coach probably needs to fit your club directive. And again, it should come really principally from your ownership or your directorship, right? You're saying, and I suppose this is the mistake that I think probably is made a little bit, is an overprescribed head coach for reasons, right? Like I think obviously you want someone who's like Pep Guardiola, right? So you can end up making the mistake that, okay, as long as we really strive to find that person, and that comes from a heavily prescriptive game model, we're heading in the right direction, right? But I think, I don't know for sure, I would assume head coaches are distributed under like a power law. So there are very, very, very few extreme value-added head coaches, and then the rest of them are able to roughly get the club around where budget would expect, and then give or take some edges and some different skill sets that other head coaches have. I think to be over prescriptive is to perhaps cause a mistake, and then it comes down to the ownership and the directorship saying that this is our plan, and this is the head coach who fits into that plan. I recently learned about a head coach who was being interviewed at a club, and he said, and I love this line, I can't be your plan. I am not your plan. I am a head coach who'll come into this club, but I need a plan from you as to where the club is going. I am not that person, right? I'm not going to set that for you. I think that's a great way to look at it. I think that head coaches should run in 3-year cycles. So I think that it's sensible as a club to say, and if Celtic, for example, might say for 3 years, we just want someone who's going to return this kind of variance on performance. We just want someone who's going to have us, and our very worst day is top league competitive, right? So they don't need a club model. They don't need a game model. They don't need any particular overarching characteristics. They need to be someone who can work with any group, or any player in most formations. That's our 3 year, right? That gets the fans back on side. That gets the club happy. That gets us back in the Champions League. Happy days. And then post those 3 years, you have another 3 year cycle where you say, okay, and then's the time, and the recruitment can work in lockstep with that 3 years to line up a squad in 2028 that we then bring in the positional play guy, right? Or the game model guy who can then come in and maximize, because our IQ's been raised around winning, right? We've got trophies, we've got teams and players who are used to winning. Then we can lock that in with positional play or game model, right? And we can use that 3 years to work towards that. I think that's pretty sensible. The issue around head coach recruitment becomes that the data, it is coming, right? I think everybody's going to be doing this. I think that Andori Iraola is just a revelation. I mean, I suppose if you followed what he did in Spain, it wasn't particularly surprising to you. I watch a lot of Italian football, and De Zerbi was known to me for a long time before he got to Brighton. So, but those kinds of big levers you can pull with these top but very small population coaches who can just transform clubs. That's obviously what you want. But yeah, most coaches don't have those kind of value added. And I think that the way you recruit a coach must work on these 3 year cycles, right? Where you want to be and where you need to be. It's very hard to look at event data for coaches because, it's skewed by all sorts of things, right? Celtic head coaches will on balance generate more XG, concede less XG. The kind of hallmarks of metrics there are just skewed by personnel. The league distribution, if you've got a complete monopoly league where there's one team who just smash it every year, the head coach of that club can look quite handy when maybe they're not, right? In terms of their value added. I think what Celtic do have is a space where the league campaign can perhaps make a head coach appear to provide massive value added, and Celtic can play on that. I think that if they attach some kind of, look, if a Premier League comes and gets you, whatever the release clause is, all the best. I think that they can take advantage of their league scenario and almost make some generative income off managers. I think that'd be quite easy for them.
So we're just going to wrap up soon, but we want to get towards the idea of how we would take Celtic going forward. Celtic are in a unique position at the moment because it's a bit of a blank slate. So many of the positions are in interim at the moment. Yeah. We've lost, obviously, the head coach and Brendan Rodgers. We lost Coach Jack. We lost fitness guy Driscoll. We lost former golfer and hockey player Adam Sadler. So we're in a kind of unique situation where we have a blank slate, but we're also trying to build the train as it's going down the tracks. So if we were to give you, Jack, the power of kind of creating Celtic going forward, we don't have a sporting director or a technical director. We've never had a director of football. What would you see as being the kind of unique? What would you see as being the kind of the positions that you would want to fill as soon as possible, given the kind of unique position that Celtic are in that in the league we have to play swashbuckling and attacking football, but then we pepper that throughout the season with European football where we have to kind of quickly change and not be so attacking. What do you think are the kind of areas that you would want to focus on building Celtic first of all?
It's an interesting dynamic, as I say, because your league is going to be way simpler competitively to achieve in and around your goals, right? But yeah, you're right. Like, you can't turn up in Europe. I think for a head coach, the old principle of like first do no harm, right? You want a coach who's not going to bed a game model into a club so prescriptively that it actually ends up damaging the club, right? That can't happen. I think that ultimately a level of pragmatism is needed between being someone, as you say, who can roll out an 11 to go and do the business away at Dundee, and then also just try and lock things down against Juventus. But, I mean, maybe it's the psychological biases of kind of remembering Nakamura, right? So, like, there may be an attacking scenario where you actually find that, particularly at home, that you can actually go at teams and they'll kind of wilt under what the home ground and the home team and the home performance can do to visiting clubs in the Champions League. So there's probably an edge that maybe I don't see Celtic using too much. I think from my perspective, although you said there's a head of data in place, I think that progressive managerial appointments need to be made around the role that the club is going to have with recruitment and data. I think that a head coach needs to be cognizant of his group and his training sessions, right? But not necessarily become too embroiled in the recruitment side of it. And I think that most managers from overseas are more used to that model, right? The sporting director model is older in Germany and Spain than it is in England. And I think that if a head coach is brought in, it needs to be someone where there's a 3-year plan from the club and the coach fits that model, and then they're comfortable taking a backseat on recruitment and data. And I think that sort of future is looking pretty, that seems to be the future of the game. I think that there is a ton of young coaches who would enjoy the experimentation of having the competitive advantage that Celtic squad gives them. And, I think there are a lot of coaches who go into clubs where the starting 11 and the tactics within the starting 11 can look quite innovative because the ultimate match winners in the team will just solve the problem of how the game is won, right? I think that there's a bigger role here to have a younger coach who can learn and grow, right? And as I say, they'll be attractive to other clubs above them. I think Celtic also can take a market-based approach on, so like Premier League clubs, there's certain places Premier League clubs just won't buy out of because of the risk profile. So they're really happy to pay a premium on a player rather than go and get them directly from Slovenia. They'll say, well, let's let him go to Italy and then we'll just pay the premium when we know he'll be good in Italy, right? So I think Celtic could definitely be a bridge case, particularly around the softer ESC and GBE rules in Scotland, could definitely be a bridge club where, okay, let's have this guy hit the British Isles under us and we can flip him for a lot of money into the Premier League when they know that there's proof of that performative advantage if they do play well in the Champions League. So I think Celtic should look, and they sort of have done this, but like not a few emerging markets, but perhaps a breadth of emerging markets to say, these are players we can take a risk on because the sum total of our 11 on the pitch will never kind of drop below a certain level. So we can take a risk on a name here and hopefully flip him into the Premier League. And then, yeah, just be cognizant of what's fashionable in the Premier League at the moment. Like, it's all physicality in the Premier League. And these things tend to transition between physicality and technicality. If Celtic went and got some technical players from an emerging market and sort of tried to catch when the physical characteristics stop being preferential and the technical ones drift back in, you can sort of maybe plan to make a throughput of players going into the Premier League that will go sell for some money.
One of the issues we've had recently is, well, actually, the last few years is Brendan Rodgers getting signings and then claiming that he's never heard of them. In the first time we had him, Marion Shred was one that he kind of scanted publicly in a press conference by saying that he didn't know who he was after we signed him. And then this time, obviously, with Inamura and players coming from the J-League. How do Celtic bridge that gap as a club? Is it a case of we need to have our ducks in a row when we're appointing the manager and say this is the way that we operate? And why is that not happening? Why would we be in a situation again for the second time where the manager is claiming that he doesn't know players when they're coming in?
I suppose it's down to the legacy of what a manager is, right? Like there is a concept that clubs need to leave recruitment vague, right? In terms of you come into this club, you know, if there's a difference between somebody that everybody really, really wants as a head coach, right, and someone who nobody's massively keen on, the difference is the one everybody wants heavy involvement in recruitment. I think that's often conceded that they can take part in that. What tends to happen there is that managers like players who are like low on variance, so they kind of want to know what will happen when they're on the pitch because their job's on the line. Even if that's bad, right? Even if he has several deficits that I know, right, but I can mitigate them. But I know him, and I know that there's a lack of variance on that guy, right? So that's where it becomes tempting then to sign players that this manager's had before, or it can all just coalesce into this very kind of safe, squad. I think that you need to kind of steer away from that and just say to like who's brave, and part of it will be like how much can the directorship guarantee the job of somebody coming in, right? So if you hire a head coach and say, look, we're going to give you an 18-year-old, well, he needs a threshold of minutes. Your shout as to when they're played. You're not going to cop it if he doesn't appear, right? We are a development club. If that's what you choose to be, we think that because of our league context, we can take certain risks that nobody else can. So we'll promise you that you'll have a hell of a lot of freedom in your game model. But we're saying that these players need to go on the pitch, right? As long as the manager's protected from feeling the heat, if that goes wrong, then I think that you can set up quite a safe environment for a manager to be really brave in his selection.
So there would be a literal prescribed minute count that the manager would be told this player needs to play X amount.
Yeah, I think so. Or that's contractually promised, right? So the club are on the hook to pay this guy a lot more unless he gets on the pitch, and then that reduces, right? So you can leverage contracts to say, but ultimately, what ends up happening generally is the manager wins more games. The fans really like the manager because he wins more games. Ownership feel like the manager's kind of less, it's less their prerogative whether the manager goes because of the fan reaction. and then the manager starts to encroach upon recruitment because they want that reduction in variance, and then this vicious cycle starts again. So the ownership feel they can't get rid of him because the fans would hate it, and then the manager just starts to amass more power and start walking in rooms that maybe he wasn't walking in before, and dictating certain things, or like, look, I integrated those 3 players with you. That was really good, right? But there's someone I want, and I know he'd work for me. And nobody else likes him, but I like him, right? I know what he can do. And then the club are like, okay, well, he has delivered us a certain amount of success, so let's do that for him, right? I would suggest there's a bigger market of head coaches that Celtic could choose from where they don't necessarily need to get themselves in that position. And I think that, you saw what Brighton did to De Zerbi. I'm not attuned to Brighton's fan base, but I'd assume he was quite popular. And he was wanted by like a lot of elite European clubs, but Brighton came to an agreement with him that he could leave, right? Because he didn't service their football function or their game model, their club model. So I think you sort of have to start to try and wrestle back a bit of that, silo. Yeah. And within specialisms, right? Like multidisciplinary specialist stuff. You don't. I mean, I suppose that would be reimagining a football club, right? Like, industry experts, industry professionals working within their domain who are all able to communicate. A manager is one of them, but he's not the voice.
One last question from me as well, because we've also spoken about how do you bring head coaches in that fits a certain style and a certain structure. I guess the problem we've always had with Celtic is we have a shareholder, a minority shareholder, who even last week in a recent statement says that, this structure that we have where the manager does all the football stuff, the CEO or senior management does everything else, and the board oversees it. It's worked for 20 years. It works. Nothing's wrong with the structure. And Dermot Desmond has been on record before saying, you can't really do long-term planning in football because it's so short-term. And I guess in terms of if you, and you kind of mentioned it earlier as well, you'll have owners who are very successful outside of football who run their businesses in a certain way. But when it comes to football, they go, well, I guess we just have to run it this way because that's the norm. And I guess for yourself, you try to kind of, I know there's a very grand question, but if you wanted to kind of reimagine how to run a football club or the structure or the viewpoints of that, would that lie in a lot of stuff like maybe it doesn't have to be short term? You could have a structure that looks after today, but also tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I would say that if you're a club owner, it is ultimately up to you what values you reward, right? So, I mean, I suppose this is something that confuses me, is like an ownership will come into football and they're told it's very short term. Firstly, I don't believe there's anything that needs to be short term about football. I think if you're confident you're taking decisions for tomorrow and that trajectory is serviced, right, you can lose games and it hurts, but you can lose games and not lose sight of what the long term looks like. I think that probably an issue that a lot of football clubs make is there are industry professionals who want to run high risk, high reward actions to service their personal careers, and then that becomes detrimental to the football club because, what's attractive about building a 5-year, 3 to 5 year recruitment model that incrementally improves and integrates young players, right? If you've got a key stakeholder in the club who wants to work in the Premier League in a year, they're just going to pull massive levers to try and get themselves into rooms for those job interviews where they can say, well, we bought him and he was great, right? So you're up against the kind of personal ambition of football professionals, which is an issue. I don't think football needs to work in a short-term way, and I think that I'm in touch with what a club needs to look like to not run in a short-term way. But again, it is the owner's prerogative to jump in and reward. If the owner gets a call from whatever person at Celtic says, we're going to sack the head coach, the owner can just say, well, I don't want you to do that, right? He's someone we've employed for a 3-year cycle, right? We're 12 months down the line. Like, what are you doing? Like, so I think that that's probably where owners need to be more in touch with how they want their club to run. Some owners are at the behest of translators at executive level who'll say, this is the club, this is what the house is on fire, I'm telling you that, right? And this is the remedy we need to take. Most owners take that on trust, and I don't think those circumstances are common enough to warrant that happening. And again, what a lot of directorship people will do is say the house is on fire, but don't worry, I can put it out, right? And then that wins the trust of an owner. But actually, the what is it? The medicine's worse, the cure's worse than the disease, kind of thing. So yeah, it is up to an owner to entrench those values and to say, look, football might be short term, not on my watch, right? This club works in a long term way, and that's what I'm going to work towards. I think you can have. I'm sorry, I'll wind up, but you can have the most technically excellent support staff, wider staff. I think if the ultimate decision maker is not aligned, everything falls down, right? You're only as good as your key decision maker. So I think at ownership level, it's important to set those values that you want. And yeah, football just does not stand still. I don't think that if something's been established for 20 years, that it makes sense to say that, well, that's how we're going to keep it, right? Because television deals or audiences, changes in emerging markets, that there is no nation or league in football that just says, right, well, we'll stand still, right, and the status quo is going to remain. I think that football clubs need to be long term, but not tone deaf to industry changes, right?
I think that goes back to what you said at the start about how these businessmen come from other areas where they're using data, and then when it comes to football, it just seems to clunk out of their minds. And as someone who teaches business, I can't think of a single industry where the business is the same as it was 20 years ago. So why do they think that football should be the same as it was 20 years ago?
And I think it's around, it might have been Ian Graham who said football, and this, if this is a misquote, I apologize, but football's the only industry of equivalent size where data's even a debate, right? There is an assumptive. You couldn't work in retail and say, we'll just eyeball the amount of people that come through the door and buy these top. Oh, well, why wouldn't we use data on that and just measure the units of sold? Oh, no, come on. The eye is king, right? I'm just going to eyeball it and we'll just get a vague sense of what's going on, right? You would be dismissed on the spot, right? Quite rightly. So the fact that I don't think that there is this debate. I think football, the decisions are made traditionally, but data is fully embedded in the game, in the margins. And I guess it's for people like me to make the job of decision makers, sort of swing the way of data as much as possible, and to probably take them through what's been constructed to get to a decision. But all of that requires time.
Well, Jack, we won't take up too much more of your time. It's been a pleasure. I hope listeners have got some good insight into the business from this. So thanks very much for coming on.
No, thank you for inviting me. I apologise for not touching on the specifics of Celtic, I guess, but hopefully it's thought-provoking to the fans of the club who can recognise other ways of approaching certain problems. And
Christian, I will speak to you again when I'm contractually obliged to do so.
Behind the paywall. So you should have mentioned the Cynic.co.
Well, this has been Reimagining Football, and we'll catch you down the road.
Thanks to Graeme and Christian, and of course to Jack for a fascinating look at modern day football recruitment. As Christian said, if you head along to the Cynic.co and sign up to our Celtic FC subscription service, you get on average around 35 podcasts per month covering everything Celtic related. News, stats, tactics, reactions, features, Celtic FC women, and lots more. We're fully independent with no adverts or interruptions. Go to thecynic.co or search for The Cynic on Patreon. It's paradise in your pocket.